Hello, it has been quite some time, but welcome to this new video. So this time I will handle the topic of ESL Retro Cup, which is a Th12 Cup with no siege, no heal and no healers. And the video, as usual, will be divided into some parts. So in the first part I will talk about what are the basics of this tourney and what are the basics of my base building within this tourney. After this I will show 3 bases that I built, talking in depth about the trapping and the defense positioning and all of that. And then lastly, I will show all the bases that I built, which are 9, with and without traps, so that you can try to plan with your own strategies and see if I actually managed to trap that or not. And then I will also show some defenses that we had. Unfortunately, we only played 3 matches, including one where the opponents were not so great. So I don't really have many videos to show you, but this will still be quite enough, I believe. So let's get started with the first part, which is this tourney and how I built inside this tourney. So as you heard, this tourney is no heal, no healer, no siege, which means that a lot of the attacks are simply not viable anymore in this setup. Which is why, for example, you won't see queen charges and you won't see super witches with healers, and you cannot see P.E.K.K.A smash attacks with healers, because of course there are no healers. And most of the times, unless you are a certain French player, you won't ever see Hawks, because with no heals it's quite hard to use them. So the main attacks I would say are Donut Lalo, Zap Lalo, Zap Dragons or Super Dragons. And then on some specific bases, especially on Th12, you may see, for example, Super Witches, without healers of course. You may see Witches, or you may see even Super Dragons on Th12. But in general, I would say that the main strategies are Lalo on Th3, and in some cases Dragon Super Dragons. And on Th2, mainly Dragon Super Dragons and Super Witches, unless you can Th12 Th12, in which case then Lalo also becomes viable. So what are the basics? Well, first of all, in case you are not familiar with the donut, so let's explain what it is. So let's say that we have 2 key defenses, and then I have this setup, which is a quite standard setup. So for example, let's say that this is the compartment that I have in my base, and then essentially, if you use the donut, you can place an invisibility spell right in the middle, and this is the exact range of the invisibility spell, which means that you will be able to donut both of these key defenses. And the donut setup consists of 1 rage, then 3 or 4 invisibilities depending on the defenses or the buildings that you want to get. And you can use bat spells. You can use 1 for each defense that you want to get, or you can use a skeleton spell in case you are not targeting a defense. So in this case I will be able to get both of these 2 key defenses, which is not great. But another possibility is to have my clan castle here, and so if this is the setup, then I will be able to get both of these buildings, which is not really ideal. So basically, if you try to build a base, what you want to do is to place the clan castle away from key defenses. So for example, you can't really do a base which is, let's say, like this, because then people may be able to donut these 2, which is not what you want. And so, at least in my bases, the 2 main clan castle locations were basically near the town hall, so you could place, let's say, something like this. And you could also do a core town hall, so maybe you could do like the town hall like this, and then maybe you could place the eagle. Of course, the eagle and the town hall are key defenses, and they can be donuted, however they require too many spells, and so people don't really go for it. So this was my main thought process about the key defenses. I wanted them to be quite spread from each other, so that a Sui or a split Sui couldn't really get 2 of them, so that Donut couldn't really get 2 of them. And also I didn't want them to be really close to the edge, for example, let's say like this, because then in this case you may be able to trade whatever defense I have on the outside. So let's say that this is my Inferno compartment, and then you could be able to trade these two and then just send the rocket loons into the Inferno, which is an easy trade. And unless you are betting that, so for example, unless you are having a Tesla farm, you don't really want to do that. So this was my main thought process. Now regarding, for example, air defenses, what I usually did was have them in this kind of shape. So it's my usual C shape or U shape, depending on the angle. And this means that I can place my radar bombs in places where the hounds are not really going. So let's say that this is a hound. Hounds can go this way, so I don't really want to place the traps in this path. But they could also explode, and you know that the explosion radius is more or less the reference radius. So from this, for example, as you can see here, it's right about here, so I don't really want to place traps within here. And so from this it's quite clear that the spots in which I can place the radar bombs are here. But actually you could also send hounds, so that, for example, let's say that from here it goes here, so maybe it explodes here, and this is within the radius. So you also need to consider where the hounds are dropped into their defense. And of course, no Lalo attack will usually go into 4 air defenses. So let's say that here I have the defense, but maybe this is, for example, towards the end of the attack, which means that the hounds would die before reaching that, which means that it would be fine to place bombs close to that, because hounds are not really getting there. Or I could also cite the other example, so that, for example, this air defense is taken down first, which means that if you send a hound, the hound will go, let's say, like this, for example, or like this, and will probably die around here, which means that you may be able to place air bombs like this. But of course, this is all base dependent. And another shape of air defenses is the so-called Y shape. And as you can see, there is one air defense in the core. However, I didn't really like this shape because it was harder to trap, in the sense that a lot of the base is covered by the air defense range, which is the hound popping range. And so it was quite hard for me to trap this, especially because you could also send hounds this way. You could argue that you could place radar bombs here, but it's all depending on the attack, and so I just wanted to go for the safe bet. And another thing to remember about air defenses is that dragons and super dragons are really popular. So for example, let's say that this is your setup. So let's say that this is your base. Is there like a good setup or bad setup? Or so let's say that I have a base like this. If I do it like this, it means that dragons cannot really chain into their defense, especially electro dragons. Otherwise, if my setup, let's say, was like this, then they could chain cannon into their defense. And so you could use the Electro Dragon trick, which is to use a Rage and then an Electro Dragon, and it will take their defense with the first chain. And so I don't really want to do that, which is why I always have a total gap between the defense and the outer building. Another possibility is to have, as I said before, a rocket loon trade. So let's say that I have this base, and then people could just send rocket loons into here, and then they go onto their defense. Or another possibility is to just trade the cannon with regular loons and then rocket loons into their defense. And so you need to be careful, because usually one outside defense is not really enough to prevent a rocket loon trade. So a possibility is to use 2 of them, or you could also use 1 and then have a surprise Tesla, so that more rocket loons would be necessary. And since people would actually see this type of base, because this is 1-hit format, they would still go for it and they may fail. So these are various possibilities that you can try to use, or you could simply try to bait it regardless, but it also depends, because as I said before, if you have the defenses close to the core, then the radar bomb spots are less. However, if they are too close to the outside, they can be easily traded, so you don't really want to do that. Another thing that you need to remember are super dragons, and as you know, they do splash damage, which means that, let's say that they are coming from the core, so maybe this is an anti-2 base, maybe the tunnel is in the core, so super dragons are in the core, and then if they go this way, since these two buildings are touching, it means that super dragons can target the elixir storage and it will, let's say, chain or splash damage into their defense. And so this is why if you use, especially near infernos, so let's say that I have, for example, I don't know, maybe I have this kind of compartment, so I have this very common, very standard inferno compartment, and let's say that this is my core. So if I have a setup, let's say like this, as you can see, the Electro Dragon can chain Inferno into Elixir Storage into the Wizard Tower. However, the Super Dragon can only hit one target at once. But if I go this way, then the Super Dragon from the core will target the Elixir Storage, which will splash damage the Inferno. So you need to be careful about which type of spacing you are using, and especially in my case, I thought that Electro Dragons are easier to defend, and actually Super Dragons are really strong, especially against anti-2. So this is why 1 tile spacing was preferred over 2 tile and 0 tile spacing. Because of course, if I do here this setup, it's 1 tile here, and then it's 1 tile here, but if I do like this, it's 2 tiles here and 0 tiles here. So you need to be careful because of course the base is not really infinite. So this was my thought process. And then other things that are worth mentioning are Easy Funnel and the Super Goblins in general. So let's say that I have my tunnel here, and then maybe I have this tunnel compartment here. Then if you have, let's say, resource buildings, then you will need a lot of super goblins to trade them and then go into the tunnel. Granted that another possibility is to just do a Sui that will wrap all around, and then you can super goblins the tunnel, which is why it's also important to have storages inside the tunnel compartment. But if you don't really have them, then super goblins can quite easily go into the tunnel, which is what you actually want to avoid. But on the other hand, if you have non-resource buildings, let's say that you have something like this, it means that this barrack is harder to funnel. So let's say that maybe this is my setup. So this barrack is harder to funnel because, I don't know, let's say that this is actually my setup. So in this case, you can't really use a wizard because, of course, I have a cannon. And you can't really use a minion because I have another defense, so maybe you will be forced to use a baby dragon, maybe you will be forced to use, let's say, a giant in front, or maybe the king with something behind, hoping that it goes the right way. And of course, if you have, let's say, a Tesla, then it will pull the king away, so you also need to be careful about that. So you need to juggle the resource buildings and the no-resource buildings, especially I would say that, let's say that this is my base, so maybe something like this would be fine, in the sense that on the outer layer it's fine to have resource buildings, but in the inner layer, so let's say that then maybe I have my base here, I have, I don't know, something, I have my Inferno. So in the inner layer it would be better to have no resource buildings so that it's harder to funnel. And so, for example, a king will just wander around, which is why also in my bases you will see a lot of modes, you will see a lot of wiggles, you will see a lot of wall pieces to just try to make Sui as hard as possible. You will also see open walls because I want to make the super wall breakers just go wherever and not exactly where the attacker wants. So these are just some of the tools that I will be using. Of course, you need to remember that loons and super loons do splash damage, so in this case they could just send a super loon to trade the archer tower, or just normal loons, and they will also kill the laboratory, so you could try to use 1 tile spacing, or you could use a higher HP building, which is, for example, the lik-storage, although it is a resource building, so you could use super goblins again. Another possibility is that you could try to simply use more defenses, but they are not really infinite, so you need to be careful about that. And in general, what I tried to do with this basis was try to reduce the value that the attacker could get from any point, which is why, for example, you will see that, let's say this is my tunnel compartment, you will see that you can't really get two air defenses from the same compartment, which means that you may need to do a split sui, or you may need to just zap one or trade it. And especially for the eagle or for areas away from the clan castle, this is really good. Another thing is that I am reducing the zap value, so for example this in my case would not be great, because you can zap the defense and the archer tower together, which is just free value. So this is why I don't really want them close to each other. But for example, it's fine to have an archer tower close, but not so close, because it will help in killing the lava poops. You could also have the warden, because the warden takes more zaps than the defense to be killed. So this is also another possibility. So you can just play around. And of course, being ḽļᴘ one of the most predominant attacks in this format, it's also very important how you use wizard towers. So the way that I use them was usually away from their defenses. So as you can see here, let's say that if I place a wizard tower here, it's in the range of the defense, which means that the wizard tower will actually target the hound instead of the loons. So I just place it a little bit away. And then especially near the core, I just have a lot of splash, and I have some red air bombs around here, so that they can act as, let's say, an extra inferno. And especially you can consider forcing the tomb, or at least having multiple points in which the tomb would be needed. So for example, let's say that I have my tunnel in the core, and then I have pathing that goes like this, just as an example, of course. Then let's say that I have something like this. So for example, this is my setup, and so in this case, this can instantly kill the loons, so it's not really ideal, and it would require a tomb. This has two radar bombs and a tornado, and maybe I also have some splash nearby, which could be the wizard tower, or which could be the inferno, or whatever. And so this would also be a great spot to tomb, but of course, if you tomb here, then there is the town hall. So if I have, let's say, good pathing around the town hall, or if I have this just a little bit more exposed, then it means that your tomb will not be able to cover the town hall, which is why anti-2 bases were really popular in this setup, and which is also why in anti-2 bases you don't really want to ḽļᴘ unless your sui can get the town hall. So these are basically the main points in which I will focus my bases on, and if there is anything extra I will just explain it while I go. And now let's go into the first base. Okay, so this is the first base, and I will not go over again all the trapping and all of the explaining that I did, but I just want to explain what I'm doing. So as you can see here, this is an anti-2 base, and I am trying this style, which has only the tunnel and maybe the sweepers in the core, so that everything else is around, which means that pathing into the tunnel is not easy at all. Especially as you can see here, for example, on the top I have pathing that goes this way, and on the bottom basically I have the same. Maybe loons could go into the tunnel from here, but maybe I could also have some Teslas here, so you never know. And of course you are free to just move the stuff around to fit traps and Teslas, so this is the main idea. And then as you can see, I have here a hole, so that a super wall breaker will be hard. And then here I have this dark barrack, so that funnel will be harder. I cannot place it here, because otherwise any dragon could chain into their defense, which is not really what I want. I have wall pieces, so that it's harder to funnel into the town hall, into the inferno, especially for the queen. I have a lot of dead zones, so that you cannot really access DPS or splash from adjacent compartments. So for example, if you do a 𝙼 into the Inferno, then you cannot really access any of the exobos, and vice versa. So this is quite good spread of DPS, I would say. And also this requires a split 𝙼 if you want to get a lot of value, or it requires a heavy 𝙼, which is, for example, with a golem. So as you can see, with the Infernos, I have them with a lot of defenses around so that they are able to actually target loons, because otherwise, if you have an Inferno with no defenses, then it means that for once it cannot really target anything, and it may be easy to snipe with rocket loons because it may be quite isolated. For their defenses, as you can see here, I don't really have them close to the edge because otherwise you could set any dragon here, and I have some defenses in front to try to prevent the Electro Dragon, the Rocket Loon's snipe. But I could also have some Teslas in between here, so maybe they could say, okay, let's trade, for example, the Mortar, and then send Rocket Loons, but if I have some surprise Teslas, this will fail. And here I have some openings, so that if they try to do a 𝙼, the heroes will go into here and then outwards, so they will avoid the tunnel. Here I have some storages in case they just use dragons or super dragons, so that they will be stuck on the storages while there is damage around. As I said before, the 𝙀😘 here is near my eagle, and also here I have a lot of DPS, and this is quite a hard zone to 𝙼 because it's a lot of DPS, but it's also a zone that you don't really want to be backend, because you may just fail. And as you can see here, I have 2 air defenses, and also the dead zone helps into separating their defenses, so a 𝙼 into the Inferno will not be able to get 2 air defenses. Here I have 3 wizard towers, which as you can see are slightly away from their defenses, which means that they will be able to target the loons, and it also means that you cannot really use buds here to get the eagle, the expos, and their defenses. Another possibility is that, for example, they could do skeletons to grab the eagle, the queen, and the 𝙀😘, so it's like a donut but without the invisibilities, which is a possibility where you don't have a lot of splash, which is why the wizard towers are also really important, especially near the eagle. And in general, that's the format of this base. As you can see, I have a lot of potential Tesla farm spots. So I have basically every storage could be a Tesla farm spot, but especially here near the bomb tower, and since of course the base is symmetrical, near the other bomb tower, and then here near those storages. And of course, since hogs are not really a thing, and hybrid is not really a thing, and super archers are not really a thing in this format, it means that I can just use all my springs against ice golems and against headhunters. And as you can see here, I have the king in front of the queen, which means that if you try to 𝙼, the king will be first, but also if you try to use the headhunters, the king will be first, unless of course you use headhunters from behind, so from this side, in which case the queen would be first. So this was the main thought process. Now these are the traps, and as you can see here, I have the Tesla farm just to be a tough backend. I have some springs against a potential 𝙼 into the queen, because I don't know if all of you know, but the most likely spot for an attacker to start in case of asymmetrical base is generally around this side, which is the 6-3 side, and this is because most attackers are right-handed, and also due to the 3D perspective of Clash of Clans. So for example, the fact that my queen is here, and it's also, as I said, on the right hand side, on the 3 to 6 o'clock side, means that if they want to do a 𝙼 into the eagle, this spot is more likely. But of course, this is not the only factor here, because on one side I have the 𝙀😘, on one side I have the queen. So it's not really the same in terms of this place, but in terms of, let's say, for example, a setup like this, if they wanted to do a 𝙼 into the expos, then I would argue that this side, which is closer to the right hand side, is the preferred one, and this Inferno is the preferred one over this one. So just one more thing to keep in mind. And also the bomb towers here are used just as an extra giant bomb. So let's say that they swing into here, then here I could have my Tesla farm, and the bomb tower will essentially be used for potting reasons, but also to be as an extra giant bomb, as I said before. So basically the king maybe would fall short to the Tesla farm and then try to pop the ability and then die into the bomb tower. So this was the main idea. Now, as for the attacks that people actually did against this base, so as you can see, most of the traps are against 𝙼𝚘, because I figured that maybe they would consider 𝙼𝚘, but also the SAMs could be placed a little bit closer to the expos if I wanted to be a little bit better against dragons. But unfortunately, I discovered that this style of NT2 is not really good, in the sense that while we were testing with our team, we discovered that super dragons were really cracked against these types of bases. And so one possible plan could be, for example, to trade this air defense, so just trade the mortar and then rocket loons into the air defense, and then just send, for example, I don't know, maybe a super dragon here to funnel and then to join the main push, which will go here into the tunnel, and then delayed heroes to go into their defense and basically try to get this old side. So this type of only the tunneling core is not good. In the future, I may go for a similar type of base, but with a much heavier core, which has, for example, the tunnel, maybe all expos, maybe all the infernos, maybe even some single infernos. So this is one of the potential ideas that I will be trying to explore for the next tourney, which is in November. And the other attack, which was actually the only attack that tripled this base in the only war that we used it in, was a very nice executed attack, which was to try to trade, or actually, which actually succeeded in trading these two defenses, and then sending super loons into this extra tower, which also got into this inferno. So after that, it was clear whether or not I had Teslas around this inferno, and then the attacker zapped the inferno, along with any Teslas that I may have had, but in this case, as you can see, I did not really have any Teslas. And then it was a heavy Sui with a golem and a queen into here, and then since this was zapped, it means that the only place where the queen can go is actually the tunnel, as long as you funnel this side. And so, of course, the king was used to funnel this side, which meant that the queen was able to go into the tunnel with a super world breaker here. The king was actually funneled very beautifully and managed to get the inferno. And then basically all that was remaining was 𝙼𝚘 into the rest of the base. And again, depending on the choice of the clan castle, you may face different results, because if you use, let's say, a super dragon, it's really hard to kill as long as you don't manage to kill it with your heroes. So it's quite hard to kill, for example, during a 𝙼𝚘, as in during the middle of a 𝙼𝚘. But on the other hand, it does not really provide a lot of DPS, so if you are trying to prevent a Sui, then a super dragon is not really going to do much, in which case you may use, let's say, super minions and hunters, or you may even use a hound to stall the queen. In this case, if I recall, I think we ran a super dragon, because it was quite hard to do a Sui into here due to all the DPS, so we figured that maybe the clan castle could stay alive, but I don't really remember, to be honest. And actually, I think the golem managed to lure the clan castle, which means that the queen was able to kill it successfully. So in this case, I guess the main issue was that the tunnel was actually reachable, or was actually easy to Sui, as long as you had a good plan. And one side note, as I mentioned before, the only way to kill the queen, or rather to target the queen with headhunters, was to try to use them from the inside, so from here, which is why I have almost all of my traps against this potential headhunter drop. As I said before, this style of anti-2 with only the tunnel in the core was not really successful, because the tunnel was successfully killed by the Sui, which is why this style, although it was used in other bases, it was abandoned after I saw the results in the ESL stream and after testing. So now let's move to the base number 2. This is the second base, and as you can see it's an anti-3. So here the main idea was simply to try to have a tunnel which is hard to 𝙬 and also has pathing around it, which means that you may not be able to get the tunnel with a 𝙬 due to all the open zones around it, and you also may not be able to easily ḽalo into the tunnel because it has no defenses near it. So I was quite confident in this style and I really liked the idea. So now taking a look at the base, as you can see there is no donut value, and there is also pathing around the core here, and if you look at air defenses, it's quite easy to see that you cannot really send hounds into this zone unless you of course plan for a suicide hound, which has no purpose rather than luring out all my traps. This Inferno is actually open, but it's quite hard to trade in the sense that I have outside defenses and I also may have a Tesla farm or at least some Teslas here. And as I said before, the tunnel is quite hard to 𝙬. I have a hole, I have wall pieces, I have moats, I have wiggles. I have also this nice little segment of walls, which makes that this expo is actually unreachable unless the troops will go behind this line of walls. So this is the main idea. I also have a ground expo, which is specifically against any type of 𝙬 into the tunnel. And looking at this base, I figure that if the 𝙬 into the tunnel is hard, and if ḽalo into the tunnel is hard, then the next possible strategy could be dragons, because of course dragons don't really die to a couple of red air bombs. So here, basically what I did was try to complicate the funnel into the eagle, which is the other next 𝙬 target for dragons, because usually you go into the tunnel or into the eagle or into some heavy or rather high value 𝙬. And so in this case here, as you can see, it's quite hard to 𝙬 because troops will most likely go outside, and I also may have a Tesla farm around here because this is my queen spot. So a 𝙬 from here is not really ideal. A 𝙬 from here may also have a Tesla farm near the gold storage, so this is not ideal. As you can see here, I don't really have any resource buildings, so here it's not really that easy to funnel. And here I may also have a surprise Tesla behind. I only have the storage because it's high HP, which means that if I have a Tesla farm around here, then troops will have to go through the storage, especially the heroes, before even engaging into the Tesla farm. And the same also is true here. And also, as you can see, this air defense cannot be reached from inside the eagle, which is one at the point, which means that even if you do a heavy 𝙬, you will not be able to get this air defense unless troops path outside or unless you do a split 𝙬. So this was the main reasoning behind this base. And now let's look at the traps and the attack that actually tripled this base. So again, you can see that I have a lot of traps in the core. I have the tornado, I have 3 air bombs and also 3 here, because I figured that with the wizard tower and the infernos, then maybe this would be enough damage. And then I have most of my SAMs against ḽalo, but they are also quite close on the inside, which means that they will also target dragons. And basically all of my springs are against the hunters, as you can see here. I also have some bombs here just in case they try to do some funky stuff with sneaky goblins or maybe the Sandy King somehow. Here also, I didn't mention it before, but this is another potential Tesla farm spot. So if you try to, let's say, funnel around here and then send the 𝙬 into here, or 𝙬 here and funnel into here, then here I may have the Tesla farm, which completely screws over the funnel plan. And looking at the rest of my traps, as you can see, this is the Tesla farm that I was talking about before, with also a skeleton trap and some giant bombs. And then the trap that I would say makes more sense in this base is actually all these that I did against ḽalo, but I already mentioned it. And the attack that actually tripled this base was actually a really nice executed attack. And so the plan was to try to 𝙬. So the 𝙬 would go into here, into the tunnel. They tried to use sneaky goblins here, but they didn't really fully get the elixir storage down. This Inferno was zapped, so funnel was created here, and then a heavy Sui was used with the golem, and so the golem went into here, and the Sui went into here with a super wall breaker. I think that if I had here some wall pieces, and here I had my Tesla farm, then the Sui would have gone around. But we didn't really consider this plan in testing, so I guess this is props to the attacker. And as you can see, after this there is not really much, so the attacker managed to have the king go actually inside with the golem, and then the queen got the 𝚘𝚢, which means that the 𝚘𝚢 was down, this Inferno was down, and I would say at least half of my core traps were down, in the sense that the wizard towers were down, and so loons wouldn't really path into that. And then basically ḽļ was all this way, which is not quite hard to do. The only 2 points of failure were this Inferno and the queen, but as long as your redhunters don't really go into the springs that I have, you are fine. And so this base was also triple. But overall, I would say that this has some potential, and in the end, I would say that this is more due to the ability of the attacker, which to be fair is to be expected in such a big tourney, rather than the base being weak. And so I think I will also try to run this style in the future, because I really liked it. And then we can move to the third, which is the last base, and then I will show all the bases and some replays. This is the third base, and it's so far, I think, my best base in the tourney, and is also the base that I like the most. So as you can see, it's again an NT3, and again I wanted to make the Sui into the 𝚘𝚢 harder, and also I didn't really want to provide pathing into the 𝚘𝚢. So you may recognize a lot of the points that I was discussing about before. Here the reference is actually chainable, but people didn't really try to chain it. So people actually tried to trade it, so they could, for example, try to kill one of the mortars and then send rocket loons into the defense. So in the future, I think an easy way to just counter it is to move more defenses into the outside. But overall, it only depends on the attacks that you are thinking of facing. The Sui into the 𝚘𝚢 is not really easy, because as you can see, I have some wall pieces here, which means that it's hard to use super wall breakers, and also you don't really know if they will target the right wall. And here this wall means that the queen is potentially able to access the 𝚘𝚢, but depending on the clan castle, which may be for example a hound, she may just be stuck on the hound. And also here I have a lot of stuff which is meant to pull the queen away, which means that even if you try to Sui into the 𝚘𝚢, you may not get the 𝚘𝚢, and if the queen goes into the core, there is not really any reachable value that you can get, apart from maybe the expos. But if you get pulled into the core, it means that 𝚘𝚢 will be up, and all 3 Infernos will be up, and there is simply no way that you can triple with ḽļ if you have that many splash buildings alive and no heal, which is available in this format. So this was the main thought process. And as you can see here, I also used an open Inferno compartment, which is, I guess by now, one of my trademarks, since I introduced it, or rather, I maybe made it a little bit more famous than it was, with one of my earlier videos, some years ago. And the reason is simply that I don't have enough walls to try to make a closed compartment, but also I wanted to have super wall breakers not work against this type of setup, which is the reason why I simply went for it. So if you send the king or queen, they will simply go around this. And then other things that are worth noting are the sweepers, which are really annoying. This Inferno, which is also really annoying, because as you can see there is pathing all the way around, which means that this Inferno is quite hard to target. And actually all these buildings are inside the Inferno range, which means that the Inferno will be able to deal a lot of splash damage. Now if you look at the air defenses, again this whole area into the core, but also this whole area
is a potential spot for red air bombs, which makes 𝙼𝚘 quite hard. I also employed this one-way reachability, which is a thing that I really like because I tend to use some wall expansive structures. For example, here I use a lot of dead zones so that the Expo and the Infernos are hard to get, in the sense that the Inferno cannot be taken from the Expo compartment and vice versa. And for this reason I simply don't have enough holes. So what I do is to use the one-way reachability, which means that from the Eagle you cannot access the Inferno, but from the Inferno you can access the Eagle. However, in this setup, the only way to access the Inferno is actually to go through the Eagle, so there is no point in having a dead zone here, because you cannot really get the Inferno unless you get the Eagle. So this was my reasoning. And here also I have the Expos to add a little bit of DPS. I have my Wizard Towers and some Bomb Towers to try to prevent skeletons into here, and also there is the Inferno. So this also can work as an added giant bomb, as I said before, in the sense that here I may have a Tesla farm, which would be quite a nice place because I have a lot of splash, and so now I just need some DPS. And considering all of these, it means that 𝙼𝚘 on this base will be quite hard, and the most used strategies will be probably dragons or super dragons. And actually the attacks that we faced were indeed this one, but I would say this base was so far the best one, because even though in terms of percentage, as you will see later, it was not the best one, in the sense that I had a base that performed really well because it held 66% and 79%, but this was more due to attackers failing to get the tunnel than really the defense rings or my traps. In this case, the attackers managed to do what they wanted to do, but the highest percentage was 88%, which means that they were not even close to tripling, and so this is not really a case of time fail, but I would say this is the case of good building. Especially so in the sense that this base was not tripled and we used it all the 3 wars. So I would say this is quite a good result in terms of base building. And so if we consider dragons, then of course the only attack that makes sense, because we discussed before that Sui may not get the tunnel, and if you do donut on the tunnel, on the clan castle, you will not really get a lot of value. Maybe you can get an Expo, but that's about it. So the attack that makes the most sense is actually to send the dragons or super dragons into the tunnel, and then to use, for example, a Sui around here to just funnel and get their defense, and then to maybe trade or zap or whatever the other air defenses, which also means that this zone of the base will be backend, so if we know that, we can try to trap accordingly. Now looking at the traps of the base, as you can see, I have a lot of ground traps into here in the 2 sides, so that it will be quite hard to use a Sui, and also these two are meant to kill maybe a golem, an ice golem, or maybe lanterns, or maybe golemites, or maybe just the archers that will spawn from the queen ability. And also I have a lot of ground traps to try to kill the barbarians or archers that will be spawned from the abilities. Here I have a really nice setup, in the sense that I have these Teslas in the core, and if you look at the base without the traps, you may not be able to guess that I actually have Teslas in the core, because this looks like a dead core. However, I do have Teslas, which means that pathing can go around the Infernos, and the loons will go into the air bombs before they go into the Inferno. And as you can see, these red air bombs are quite far from the hound pathing, and so especially in this side I have the tornado, and then later on I have these traps, whereas here I only have the traps. And so this is really hard to 𝙼𝚘, if there was ever a reason to 𝙼𝚘 this base at all. And actually these 2 springs are against a potentialized golem in case they try to do a Sui into the eagle, which to be honest was not really anticipated, but since 𝙼𝚘 was not really something that was likely, I just decided to use the springs here. And then for my SEMs, as you can see, I could have used them, for example, closer to the Infernos or Expos to be better against dragons, but I just decided to go this way because either way I figured that troops may still go around here, especially since this is a storage that you cannot really zap with air defense. So this was the main reasoning. And as you can see, I have a lot of traps on the back end, especially if you go into the tunnel and then you tomb, of course. You will face these red bombs here and then all of the splash, and you cannot really get the splash with the 𝙼𝚘, because as I said before, the 𝙼𝚘 will just go around. You cannot really use rocket loons to trade the Inferno unless you wait for a lot of time. And so this is why I think this base worked really well, because in one off I had the tunnel, which was quite hard to 𝙼, and especially this setup with all the holes, it made it so that you could theoretically 𝙼 the tunnel in a friendly challenge, but since this is a 1-hit format, you don't really want to go for an attack that has the potential of failing simply because you don't really get the tunnel. So I would say that for sure I really liked this style of base, and I will be building more of that in the future, especially since it worked so well. So now, this was the last base that I will show you with a detailed explanation, and we can consider all the bases that I did, which are 9 bases. I will just post them with and without traps. Of course, first I will post them without traps, so that you can try to consider what are the plans that you are going to use, or that rather that you were going to use in the tourney. And then you can see if I managed to trap that correctly. And after all of them, I will show some defenses. As I explained before, I don't really have a lot of defenses because we only managed to play 3 wars, and then we lost on percentage. And actually some of the defenses, as you will see, are more due to the attacker not really getting the value that they wanted, rather than the base performing really well. But nonetheless, I still think that it's really good to see this kind of defenses, because of course I can test with my team all I want, but especially since I tested mostly with 2 people, then I don't really have a big sample of attacks against this base, which is why it's really important to see what other people would do. And in general, I would say that in this format it's really important to test with multiple people to see all the entries, all the strategies that they may use. Because, for example, as I explained before, in my NT2 and in my NT3 before this, the 2 attacks that were used were not really anticipated at all, and they were not really strategies that we tested or that we even considered likely, and yet they were tripled in that way. So this is just a reminder for the future to test better, and also to try to test with more people. And overall, I think that in this format people will be using more anti-3s with the tunnel, which is not really easy to 𝙼, and also they will be using more anti-2s, because if they are well built, they are really hard to triple, and also there is even a remote possibility that the tax is just a 1-star, or maybe even a lower percentage, especially if the attack goes wrong and you have all the DPS in the core. So I think this was it for the video, or rather for the voiced part of the video. So after this you can see all the bases, all the replays, and kindly let me know in the comments if there is anything that you would like me to do in the future. So maybe I can just do a live base building, or maybe I can do something else. And let me know what you think about this particular rule set and the bases that I posted. See you next time, have a nice day.